I think for me, one of the really interesting questions is less about the tech and more about the reasoning. I would disagree with you, Carl, about it's anything like the Catholic notion of indulgences. Um, and I would suggest that it's about a concept of managing one's afterlife. So I'm just going to say that and see what people respond.
Any thoughts on that? Afterlife management services. Maggie, you know how to clear a room?
I do. I've just done it. But I mean, I think it is about the idea of praying for people after they've died, so they have a better resurrection, or in Hindu, a bit of reincarnation. I think there are some spiritual reasonings for doing some of this stuff that maybe we're not touching on, which has probably got nothing to do with the law at all. Sorry, Adina.
Well, no, but you know what's so interesting about this? What I'm reminded of is the South Korean, which is mentioned earlier today. I think Stacey, you might have mentioned it. The VR reunion. So, sort of a considerable amount of time and effort was put into producing the virtual simulation of the young girl who had died at the age of 6 or 7, Nayeon, and her mother had a reunion with her for this television program. And in terms of the spiritual dimensions of that, I know less than some other people in the room might know about Korean rituals, but it seems like, from what little I read, a kind of digital version of a shamanic ritual that might be conducted, you know, sort of formally, exclusively within the temple, a process of ushering the sort of spirit into the spirit world. And if you look at the whole video and the various things that happen along the way in that VR resurrection, it seems as though there's something sort of quite spiritually sort of distinct and meaningful happening in that process, which was something that wasn't really picked up on when some of the more kind of Western reactions in the press to this event, framed in sort of Western sort of norms about sort of, you know, grief and, you know, what's good and what's bad, didn't pick up on. So I found that really interesting, a way of kind of using the available data about this young girl to construct this was actually sort of fulfilling the spiritual purpose that was relationally carried out between the mother and the daughter. But again, doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the law, but I mean, I think that where, you know, deep fakes and simulations and things like that start happening, that over time make it more and more ambiguous what kind of entity that we might be encountering, particularly in online context, or where those kinds of simulations might be used to more nefarious or criminal purposes. We need to be sort of pretty careful about entering into that area, which is still largely unregulated. Right, Stacy. And Tamara. Oh, actually, Tamara.
I think
Tamara. Well, so can I just, sorry, Stacey, could I have Tamara first? I'm so aware that she's got a 2-year-old that might wake up at any moment. I just want to give her the chance to say, go on.
Thank you. And my apologies again for not being caffeinated at all at this hour. And so hopefully I'm being somewhat coherent. But yeah, I really liked your point, Carl, about sort of the spiritual and religious components of the digital afterlife, and how I think, you know, often in our discussions, we get kind of caught up on the tech side and thinking about, you know, well, does this AI chatbot, you know, does it really effectively simulate the essence of the dead person? Or, you know, can they really build a bot that will do what it promises? And, you know, will the digital estate planning companies, and, you know, I'm guilty of this too, maybe they'll actually die themselves before they're able to help transfer digital remains and assets to the next generation. That makes me think of, you know, earlier work by people like Genevieve Bell and people who have long been studying that really close relationship between religious ritual and digital media, and how, you know, digital media in much older forms and low tech forms, even like leaving, you know, a prepaid cell phone or a SIM card at ancestral shrines, is part of, you know, both religious ritual and sort of incorporating more contemporary mundane aspects of life into that ritual. but I also really like this very sort of boring idea, right, of like afterlife management as one other aspect of life. And so I'm always torn between wanting to focus on sort of the religious or spiritual dimensions of how people relate to technology, particularly as they imagine it and in terms of their own afterlife and communing with people who are dead. But then we do have this sort of responsible planning side. And, people like Viviana Zelizer, the sociologist, had done work on sort of the Victorian notion of life insurance and how life insurance became a moral calling. And so even within these like very, sort of boring, prosaic industries that are tied to things like responsibility and management and, doing the right thing is a kind of moral obligation. They're also caught up in these questions of transcendence and spirituality.
Stacy?
Sorry, just got so involved in that conversation that was happening now. I feel a bit far away from what did I want to say? Oh God, I think I've just completely lost the thread. But yeah, spirituality, oh, that was it. Sorry. Okay. Spirituality, technology, and history, really, really interesting, and definitely all the scholars that were mentioned, really good. But also I was thinking about the kind of just the simple mediation that technology has done, particularly during COVID. So things like, but also predating COVID. So in China, now I'm losing words, the grave cleaning or grave, what's it called again? Anyway, I think it's called no. Sorry, because I was reading the chat, I've just totally lost it. But anyway, the ceremony that happens every year, that they now have this kind of, that you can basically employ a Buddhist monk to do this ceremony on the grave and not be there. Grave sweeping. Thank you, Tamara. It's like lost everything in my head. Yes, the grave sweeping ceremony that already before COVID, there was less and less people going physically to the site because of things like pollution and traffic and all these kind of normal things. And now during COVID, there was this whole process where you could almost outsource that kind of grave sweeping to someone else, so that it's not essentially a technological system that's doing anything other than connecting the communication. But that is incredibly fundamental in terms of that outsourcing or mediation of your religious duties or your spiritual duties and care of the dead being mediated through this kind of other person that's there physically and that also is a religious figure. So I thought maybe that would add something to that conversation. But as I said, sorry for losing my track.
And I think that's really interesting. And Tal's got his hand up, and I'm going to come to you, Tal, in a minute. But I got interested there with what you were saying about, because I'm very interested in how we're outsourcing, sometimes with invitations, sometimes with not, responsibility to a lot of these platforms that we use for loads of other purposes, to kind of perform certain things for us, whether that's the preservation of the dead, or sort of whether it's like afterlife management, or whether it's sort of tweeting out sort of things in perpetuity, for the, like Jonathan was saying about the mortification, for the, kind of prayers kind of going out, sort of via some social media thing in perpetuity. And so we're kind of shuffling a lot of these kind of like functions into these platforms. But yeah, I always kind of think, well, with what are we paying for that? It might not just be just money, for that stewardship, is it, is it money? Is it privacy? Is it our data? Is it other people's data? Yeah, and with what kind of consequence? So yeah, Tal, you have your hand up.
Just a couple of points. I think if we talk about all these AI and machines and bots and algorithms, we might encounter a problem of integrity, of the integrity of the persona, and how do the coder that writes these AI codes make sure that the algorithm or the AI or the bot remains it keeps the integrity of the personality that the person had in his or her life. So this is one thing that I wanted to raise. And the other point that I wanted to raise is about the language that we use to the various terms that that pop up here. So if we talk about the collective heritage that we leave behind, so I think that the right term in English is heritage, but when we talk about personal, it's legacy. But in both cases, these are this is information, or this is narrative that that we want to leave for the next generation. And we started this discussion and this day with remains, which is something that is not necessarily part of the legacy and part of the heritage. And we also, if thinking about the integrity of the identity of the person, we also need to consider that there is some information that the person might want to leave out of his or her legacy. That's it.
Well, what do you mean by integrity of the persona? How is that determined or defined, Tal, in your mind?
I don't really know how to define it, but you know, we have various information that we leave behind, but there is only part of it that we want to leave behind for other people. And there is this question of integrity. What truly represents the real me in life? Now, of course, some of the data that was aggregated about me that I don't wish to leave behind for other people to be able to access is part of my of the integrity of my personality, and yet I'm not sure that I want to have it accessible for others. And we can also speculate about, you know, malicious uses of such bots when people will abuse these systems to do bad stuff for other people, like create a distorted personality of the deceased, or conveying messages that were not originally there, and kind of interfere in the mourning process.
I mean, well, I mean, I've got some, I mean, I sense that we might be having clashing ontological positions with respect to stuff like, you know, the real me, etc. But I think what you say about the kind of hijacking that can occur, the kind of like body snatchers of, you know, of the digital sort of thing to do harm. And Maggie asked the question about could a bot cause the dead posthumous harm? And I'm, you know, kind of concerned in this question with can a bot cause the living posthumous harm through the kind of this body snatching kind of phenomenon, which we're already arrived at, of course, and which can be only more well developed as time goes on. Cyber tomb raiders, yes, yeah. I mean, I guess when I think about the social and relational sort of thing, because I don't know, when I think about, there's something in me that just sort of grinds to a halt when I think about real me or kind of integrity or of the persona, because from where I'm coming at it, it just feels like that feels so co-constructed or co-constituted within individual relationships. That kind of gets to the heart of so many of our problems in the digital realm, of course, is that there's this kind of like digital remains, but then there's all of these people kind of experiencing and narrating and sort of seeing these as very different and is constituted in the relationship. So let me just see if there's any. Adina, a lawyer's got her hand up.
Yes, because you've just, with Maggie, just started or opened this can of worms that we lawyers, well, me especially, and Lillian always objects, and many people in this area object when they listen to my talks, is this question of harm. And Jonathan has talked about that in his paper, and probably will mention again the loss concept, the harm, the damages, etc., all the legal concepts. But what I refer to normally as arguments harming the dead, and I borrow obviously from social science and humanities a lot there, because in law there is little to borrow from, and I do like to take this critical and theoretical perspective. So I'm looking at questions such as relational harm to the surviving family members and others, but also harm to the dead itself, looking at something that I really clumsily called the chilling effect to the dead that occurs pre-mortem, and something that relates to then postmortem privacy paradox that Tal and Michael talk about. So I wonder if colleagues from other disciplines can bring in more, and I know in some of the videos, many of you have mentioned different types of collective harms, societal harms, etc. So I wonder if anyone has a new take or an additional take on the concept of harm that we struggle with when it comes to that in law.
I have a thought, and as a lawyer, and it's not really addressing what you just said there, Adina. Oh, do any non-lawyers want to talk? Oh, well, here's a lawyer, he's going to talk. Sorry, but no, I think that it is a very interesting point, but it comes back to what I was kind of saying in the first session this morning about certainly harm can go beyond merely patrimonial and non-patrimonial, but I think within the private context of wrongs which can be done to the dead person themselves or the relatives of the deceased, you are dealing in the realm of private law within the context of patrimonial or non-patrimonial harm. But you're absolutely right in that there are public dimensions to this as well, and this is where I get uncomfortable, because even though I'm a lawyer, very much a private lawyer, when we get into the public law sphere, start getting a wee bit more lost. But that is the point at which I think that there is scope to talk about criminalisation of certain conduct or the like, because you're very much in that public sphere. But within the context of the private, I certainly do think it's possible for a bot to harm a deceased person. I think that it's quite easy to imagine a situation in which the bot could do something which causes patrimonial damage to the estate of the deceased person, or to have a situation in which the bot tweets out insulting information or something like that, and gives rise to a kind of defamatory type situation there, which yeah, I think that there are difficulties with that, but I don't think they're insurmountable difficulties, and I don't think they're difficulties that necessitate ripping up the whole edifice and the structure that we've got in place at the moment and radically rethinking everything. I think there are objections which can be met with consideration of what's already in place.
I think Carl would like to come in on this.
Yeah, Carl has the excellent news that it was already solved back in the 1970s. We haven't heard that very much today. Tell us, Carl.
Yes, I mean, I'm sure if Patrick were here,
he's asleep. He's not here anymore.
Exactly, but I'm sure he would, present this argument much better than I can. But so the matter of posthumous harm, as Patrick mentioned, has been part of philosophy since actually before Aristotle. But it was considered kind of a low status question for actually a couple of centuries, up until Thomas Nagel wrote an essay called Death in the 1970s, where he actually introduces a really important distinction, which I think solves many, at least, if not all, then many of the quarrels about posthumous harm. And the distinction he makes is between states of harm and facts of harm. So he's saying, well, we talk about harm as if it is one thing, but then he says, well, we would both consider, for instance, physical pain being harm, but we would also say that being betrayed or humiliated would be a type of harm. But then he says, but look here, being humiliated doesn't actually necessitate the experience of being humiliated, because it's not a state, it's a fact. And the fact survives the death of the body and survives the death of one's consciousness. And I think it's a really neat and well-made distinction that he makes. And I actually used it myself in my research, saying, well, look, there are things that are obviously not states of harm that we consider even to be at the core of what it is to be harmed. So if you haven't looked that up already, Adina, you nodded it as if you're familiar with the paper, but for me, that has been a very helpful resource. I think I put a link to it here in the chat.
Yeah, thanks, Carl.
Yeah.
I was just sort of referring to there is still this enormous need for us to try to convince the rest of the legal scholarship and lawyers that this actually should be considered, unfortunately.
Then give them this paper.
It solves
there's
everything.
also, an interesting thing about whether we're talking about harm as in reputation and things that have been left behind, rather than harm of the person when they are dead, which I think is quite a different thing. And I was interviewing some religious leaders last week, and I said to one of them, so do you believe in posthumous of harm? And she said no. And then I spoke to another one, and he said definitely, because when it depends where you think you are when you're dead. So I think there's another interesting conundrum in all of that.
Very interesting point. I remembered there about an unlikely source dealing with this sort of thing in a sense. It's David Walker's treatise on the law of delict from 1981, where he talks about physical assault, the delict or the crime and delict of physical assault, punching someone in the face. And he likens it to defamation. He says that they are essentially species of the same overarching wrong, that overarching wrong being injury in its very technical legal sense of affront. So essentially the root of physically punching a living person in the face and defaming a living person is in that conceptualization the same. They're both species of injuria. Different interests are affected by that injuria. The body is a separate interest from reputation. But the interesting thing here from the point that you raised, Maggie, is that under this umbrella of injuria and under the interests protected, well, we find that dignity in its main and primary conceptualization is protected by this as well. But also under this same umbrella, interference with a dead body is injuria. Digging up someone from the grave, that is a crime of violation of sepulchre, but interfering with the body before it's buried is injuria. So within that kind of framework, there is recognition that even physical acts directed against a corpse can be conceptualized as this kind of idea of reputational harm, and of harm more generally, sorry, but not reputational harm in the sense that you're talking about there. It's not like someone is publishing something which makes people think less of the dead person now that they're dead than they thought of them when they were alive. Rather, it's more direct. It's saying, okay, well, by interfering with that dead body, you have committed a wrong, and the root of that wrong has been the affront that you are causing to the body, not necessarily even the memory, the body itself, yeah, which I think is quite interesting.
Very interesting. I mean, all these social constructions around the kind of definitions or norms around harm and dignity are all really relevant here. Does anybody have any other thoughts from various vantage points on dignity and harm and how they're constructed? particularly on.
Vasily has had his hand up a while ago. I don't know if he wants to say
He
anything.
took it back down again. I thought that maybe that meant that he was.
I think I was mostly covered by the rest of the people in the discussion. I just wanted to say that in Greek law, in Greek criminal law, for example, there is an offense that relates to the violation of the memory of the dead or the dignity of the dead. And I would say, for example, necrophilia would relate not just from a perspective of, you know, extreme pornography concept, but also as a violation of the personality of that particular dead person that was being involved in the necrophilia acts. So in this respect, I think it is kind of similar. That's what I wanted to add. I guess everyone sort of made similar points.
Thank you. Adina, I was interested in your when you were talking about the chilling effect. And I think you were referring to, correct me if I'm wrong, the sort of antemortem chilling effect that can take place if you know that the situation is such that once you die, all bets are off. And how that might affect your communication, or just what you kind of put out there in life. It's a little bit more Article 10 than Article 8, really. But it's almost like freedom of expression having a chilling effect because you know that post-mortem privacy doesn't exist for you or perhaps your correspondence. And I was wondering if you could say just a little bit more about, why we don't talk about Article 10 more here in these discussions of death and digital.
I don't think they're separate, actually, because as we know, in this sort of scenario circumstance, Article 10 and Article 8 are very much interrelated, and the protection of privacy relates to one's ability to express themselves privately and publicly as well. So I think in this case, I didn't just mean to the chilling effect to one's pre-mortem freedom of expression, but also pre-mortem privacy, and then generally pre-mortem autonomy, and more broadly self-management, self-expression, etc. However we would like to call it. Obviously, this is not something that I've written about yet. These are just some of the ideas that have come to mind thinking about, and obviously building on some of what people have said and have written before. So something I think I would like to expand on, and obviously we need the data for, but I think it does relate to the data that Michael and Tal have as well in their study and the privacy, postmortem privacy paradox question.
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking that too. Felicity.
Hi, I was just in response to your question about the chilling effect. I almost wondered, did anybody ever think it was otherwise in terms of all bets are off once you're dead? Because to some extent, that was always the case. Once you're dead, you can't sue them for whatever they are going to do. And you know that whatever you did in your life is probably going to come out if someone wants to put it out there. I think the issue is more one when you get into a digital space of control. Because before you could burn your letters, although you could only burn half of them. You can't burn the ones your correspondent received. Whereas your email account, unless you know you're dying and can go through and delete everything, is probably going to sit there, or whatever else might be there. But to some extent, that was always the case. If you're a high profile figure or you're somebody who's done something controversial, you know that if you write to somebody, there's a chance that they might breach that confidentiality or that privacy. Either before your death or certainly after it, when there's nothing you can do about it. And in defamation terms, that's always a risk. I don't think it would be news to anybody that we see what happens. Sometimes it's a good thing. Things that people were too scared to put into the public domain when someone was alive because they thought they would sue about it, come out after the person's death. Take Jimmy Savile, for example. No doubt everyone was too scared to publish because they thought he'd sue. And you're dealing with very vulnerable witnesses. The reality of that defamation case would be extremely hard. Whereas once he's dead, that risk goes away completely. Now that's not a complete answer to the question. I don't think that's a new issue. And I think if people were, I don't think you were suggesting it was, but I know people don't like the letters analogy, but in truth, when you send a letter, you are sending it out there into the world, and you don't know what's going to happen to that.
Oh, 100%.
Beyond asserting your copyright rights if you're the Duchess of Sussex, but you know.
Yeah, well, there's I agree with you. I think that control is one of the things in the picture there that, you know, can be argued to be different. However, I feel, and I don't know, Adina might chime in on this as well. I think there are two additional things here. One to do with the sort of scope, you know, the sort of data surfeit and the extent to which there's been, you know, the kind of data that you've given up with knowing it, data that you've given up without knowing it, through ambient stuff, through tracking that can be triangulated in ways that was just literally never possible before. And then secondarily, the interconnectedness of that data, so that if you go under the bus, there's a whole lot of people that go under the bus with you in a way that's just kind of exponentially kind of expanded from what was the case in the past. And so again, that kind of is that impingement, like wholesale on the rights or the kind of privacy of a whole host of living persons in a quite intimate kind of way that is that's one of the affordances of the landscape we're in, and those affordances just didn't exist in the letters in a box era in the same kind of way. And so that's my thought about those things.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that, and I think there is a big problem, in particular with the first point you made, that the surfeit of data, and the data that isn't even data that you gave out, the data that's the product of your data. For example, what Facebook knows about you that you didn't tell them. They've decided that you know, have certain,
or that you signed off to because of the kind of trade-off fallacy that you're thinking, oh, this is great, I want this for free, and not realizing, not having the kind of power.
I do agree with that, and a point we made in the chat about recipients of private letters not being entitled to publish. Well, that's true, but they still might, and that might only result in a copyright lawsuit, not a privacy lawsuit. And you know, there may be reasons why they could publish, and why privacy, you would say, is not a problem. That might happen in someone's lifetime. You might say there's a public interest in publishing certain private information, but certainly after death, yes, the copyright issue is there, but in terms of privacy and defamation protection, that all falls away when you die. So I agree with that, and I do think that those points are true. And your second point, Elaine, I like, and I think it's a point I tried to make earlier, I think in the chat, a question of, are we really talking about the privacy rights of the dead, or are we talking about the privacy rights of the people who get thrown under the bus with them, as you put it? Because I think often we are, like, we're not actually that worried about the privacy rights of John Smith, who died in 1789, actually. All of us are kind of like, if we find out that he had an affair, who cares? I mean, maybe some of you don't take that view, but I think
he had an affair? No, just kidding.
The public at large are probably quite, oh, okay, fine. Whereas the issue is often Mr. X had an affair and he's dead now, so maybe we feel about him, or maybe we don't. But what we probably actually feel uncomfortable about is Mrs. X and the impact on her, Ms. Y, with whom he was having an affair, and children ABC who suddenly find out that their dad was cheating on their mom. And actually,
and all of a sudden, Mrs. X, you know, widow Mrs. X is knocking on the front door of Miss Y, having access to all of this kind of stuff. And, you know,
absolutely.
Or, you know, the German case about the privacy case, about where I think the parents were trying to kind of ascertain what went on in the days before their daughter, you know, killed themselves, the whole thing that went to the German Federal High Court, you know, so let's say, you know, they get access to all the content, and then they are going to all the families of other kids that might have been involved in some of the kind of like school politics about that. And, you know, and certain things happen as a result of having had access to that information. You know, I mean, are the, you know, what's being impinged upon there? So yeah.
Well, I agree, and to me that's not actually the privacy of the dead. That's about the broader Article 8 private and family life of the family unit,
considered separately. They can't be considered separately. And Carl's kind of said quite a lot about this as well. I don't know whether you want to chime in there, Carl.
I don't have much to add right there. Keep on going with what you're about to say.
Sorry, Stacey's got her head. Oh, try Stacey then. So.
Yeah, I don't know. I was thinking about the point that Felicity was making about not being uncomfortable about some of these things. And I was thinking about the case of women's bodies and being covertly taken pictures, and the results of that. I saw a documentary not too long ago about a woman who committed suicide because she'd been filmed while taking a shower in Korea, I think. And I think I feel deeply uncomfortable with that just as a thing, rather than with it. And I don't know whether that's just empathy, perhaps. Like, you know, I can imagine what that's like, that kind of defamation, and the fact that that leads to someone's suicide and the kind of impact of that to the family. But I think that the object itself disturbs me. The fact that it's still out there, that it's online, that you can't get rid of it because it's been copied a million times, and because on everyone's computer, you know, that scale, I think, is slightly different to if someone was to take a picture of someone in the kind of 1940s or 50s, or do a drawing of someone, you know, and share it between their group. That doesn't have quite the same, I guess, emotional linking around it.
Absolutely. I don't know whether anybody else has any thoughts on that, but to me, that gets to one of the questions that we put, you know, it's like, you know, whose story, you know, whose memory, whose control, you know, who, you know, kind of what actors are involved in sort of adding to or contributing to or sort of like editing, you know, the available material that then all sorts of observers or narrators use as kind of raw material, you know, for their own narrations of the dead. You know, and not all of the actors in that are neutral or positive actors. Felicity?
Yes, I agree with that. Thank you for that, Stacey. I think you make a good point that I sort of struggle between my lawyer personality and my human personality with my analysis of this sometimes. But I do agree, and I think I said so in my video that we did before today, that there are things that we feel are instinctively intrusive of the dead. Things like I mean, the example I used was perhaps post-mortem pictures of somebody, like the pictures that we know existed of Princess Diana, for example. But your example is another good one, and how we conceptualize that. And I think it's interesting that the law of privacy relating to the living, certainly in England and Wales, recognises intrusion as an additional and separate aspect of privacy, separate from secrecy. So, for example, the fact of an affair, the example I was giving of Mr. X, might be one thing, but photographs of them having sex, even if they were both dead, might be another. And if that applies to the living, one might say, well, can that analysis also be applied to the dead? And I think that's quite an interesting question.
Adina,
on that note, it's 3:30 and we should probably stop for a coffee so you're fresh for the final session.
Yes, that's great.
Discussion, really good.
Thanks a lot. Thank you, Elaine and Maggie, for facilitating and leading the discussion. And thanks everyone for participating. So we have the final session in half an hour where we have some new speakers coming in, the lawyers, and we have a recap and next steps and some questions for you in terms of our future activities. So hope to see you all there again. See you soon.